Well, welcome to week 2 of our series we're calling 10. Not because it's 10 weeks, but because we're talking about the 10 Commandments. I hope that last week was meaningful for you, for those who were able to be a part of that. I hope that you were able to see something maybe a little bit different about these 10 Commandments as we actually jump into them this morning. Because where we started was this idea that really in most places in the world, and frankly, in most religions, there's this idea that there's a good God and there are bad people. And although there is some truth to this, it is not where we start in our relationship with God. It's not about we're bad, He's good, and we've got to figure out how to please Him. Okay? There is no idea that if I'm good enough, He will love me. This is true in almost every other religion, and you can do some research, all right? In most other religions, if you want the God that you worship to love you, there are things that you do to earn that God's love. You live a certain way. You give a certain amount of money. You pray a certain number of times. You light a certain amount of incense. Whatever it is, there's a certain way that if you live and you act a certain way, God will love you. And although maybe I can convince you over the next 4 or 5 weeks that that is not true of our God, of the God, we kind of live that way. We kind of live sometimes in a way where if I do bad things, God stops loving me. And if I do good things, He loves me more. But the truth is that is not the case. We can never be good enough to earn God's love. And it's like, where does this even come from? Where does it come from that somehow God loves me more if I do good things? Well, a lot of it really goes back to a lack of understanding of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were the original 10 laws of the Jewish people given by God for them to follow. And it's almost like we can look back at those and we see things like don't lie, don't steal, don't covet your neighbor's things, honor your father and mother. We see some of these laws that God put in place as the standard, and we think to ourselves, because we can't meet those, because we break those, God doesn't really love us. God can't love us because we're not good enough. But what I shared with you last week was very simple. And it was that with God, rules only come after relationship. See, God had already spoken to the people. He had already delivered them from slavery. They already belonged to Him. And He said, now that you belong to me, here's a list of rules that I think keep us in relationship with each other. We even talked last week about purchasing a dog, didn't we? We talked about how my wife and I purchased our little puppy. And the question was, is he ours once he's in our fence, or is he ours when he's purchased? The truth is, we purchased him, and then we placed him inside of a yard to keep him safe. And that is very similar to what God has done with us. He has purchased us. We belong to Him. And now come the 10 Commandments because He wants to keep us safe. He's not a rule master. He's not looking to punish you. He's a God who loves His child. That's what it comes down to. And that's where we really ended last week. But I also made this statement. You can tell a lot about someone by the rules they make. Right? Each of us have rules in our own life, things that we have set in place because it makes our life easier. There's certain things that have to be a certain way, and you can tell a lot about someone by the rules that they enforce. And we've all got rules that if we had to share them out loud, we're like, I don't know why this is a big deal to me, but this is a huge deal. This is one of the rules. If you want to, so it's funny because you walk into someone's house, and I'm sure you guys do the same. When you walk into someone's house for the first time, I do the same thing every time. I immediately check the floor around the door, looking for shoes. Do I take off my shoes? Do I keep my shoes on? It's kind of 50-50. in the amount of houses I've been in. You walk in, you're kind of like, okay, where are the shoes? And then what's weird is you'll see like a giant pile of shoes, and you're like, okay, I'm supposed to take my shoes off. And then you take them off, and everybody else has their shoes on. They just don't put their shoes away. But each family has their own rules. Each person has their own rules, and we kind of look to figure out what we can learn about them based on the rules that they make. But what I want to tell you is that it's not only true that you can tell a lot about someone by the rules they make, you can tell a lot about someone by the order in which they make them. Today, we're going to go through Commandment 1 and Commandment 2. And what I want to share with you is these are not haphazardly ordered or listed. God literally put these two first because these two matter most. So we find ourselves this morning in Exodus chapter 20. Just to catch you up, the book of Exodus is the deliverance of God's people from Egypt. All right? Moses freed the people from Egypt. Actually, he didn't free them, God did, but he used Moses to free the people of Egypt. The first 18 chapters of Exodus is them getting free. 19 through the end is them at the foot of a mountain. And what's really weird is, I know this is way past what we're talking about this morning, but it cracks me up. If you think about it, they're at the foot of this mountain, they get these commandments, and then eventually God gives Moses the building of the tabernacle, right? Where like the Holy of Holies is, and he gives them all the dimensions of this. And the last thing you see in the book of Exodus is Moses approaching the tabernacle, and he can't go in. Such a letdown. Like he did all this work, and now that it's made, he can't get in. And that's how the book of Exodus ends. But in chapter 20, we're given the Ten Commandments. And this is a moment in time where God is trying to convey to his people what it looks like to follow after him. So let's start with verse 1 and 2, which is where we were last week. And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God. He's saying your God because he is already in relationship with them. He's saying, you are my people. I am your God. I'm not the Lord the God, even though he is the God. I'm not the Lord the ultimate God. Yes, he is the ultimate God. But in this moment, he's trying to communicate to Moses, I'm yours. We're in relationship with each other. I brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Then we get into verses 3 and 4, which are the first two commandments. Verse 3 says this, you shall have no other gods before me. And then verse 4 says, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shouldn't have any other gods before me. And you shouldn't make any idols, whether it's from something in heaven, something on earth, or something in the water. No idols. I am your God. What I want you to hear this morning is without these two, the rest don't matter. There's no point in not stealing, not lying, honoring your parents. To God, nothing else matters if it's not filtered through Commandments 1 and Commandment 2. So let's break these down because they can sound similar, but they're actually very different. So let's start in verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. I was actually at lunch last Sunday, and my son looked at me and he said, hey, Dad, I got a question for you. And I said, what's up? He said, now you're doing the Ten Commandments thing. I got it. I was listening. I said, okay. He said, first commandment says, you should have no other gods before me. Does that mean we can have gods after him? Fair question. And you know what I said to him? Like any good preacher, come back next Sunday and find out. That's exactly what I said to him. Now he's homesick, so he better watch this later wherever the camera is. Yeah, you better watch this later, Jackson. So the word before is an interesting word. In fact, this word doesn't simply mean there's a before and an after. So it's not you could have any other gods before me, but you can have some after me. What he's saying is you can have no other gods before me. You can have no other gods in my presence. You can have no other gods that you want me to interact with. You know how a subject goes before a king? It's that same kind of language. I will not interact with anything else that you call God. Not before me. Don't bring anything into this relationship that has priority or that is in my presence or at my level because you've made it a God. You shall have no other gods before me. The first commandment is really a conversation about who do you worship? Who you worship. Commandment 1 is who you worship. Well, that's an easy one, Tim. I don't worship any other gods. Right? Like, I don't like pray to Buddha, or I don't follow any other gods. Look, I mean, I'm in church this morning. I worship the one true God. He's not simply asking you to stop praying to other deities that you would consider a god. He's saying nothing in your life should take precedence or be at the level of me. You may not worship gods, but you have gods. I may not worship other gods, but there are things in my life that at times have become my God. And what God is telling the people then, and what he's telling us now, is that this only works if I am at the center of your life. I have to be at the center of your life. So imagine Moses is on this mountain with God, and God is saying to him, Moses, I need to be at the center of your life. And Moses is saying, no, duh. Do you see what just happened? You just freed us from slavery, God. And then you parted this giant sea and you led us through it. Of course you would be at the center of our lives. How could you not be? Look at what you've done for us. You've dropped food from the sky. You made water come from rocks. Why would we worship anyone other than you? Well, God knew two things that Moses maybe didn't consider. God knew, one, how humans are. We have a real short memory. It's funny. I mean, God, we could literally pray something, and God could answer it immediately, and we're like, look how God answered my prayer. And then 2 months later, we're like, God, who? We have a short memory when it comes to how God has continued to show up in our lives, and that's why we have to sing a song like, all my life you have been faithful, because we forget. So one, he knew how humans are. But two, he knew where this group of people, his chosen people, had come from. See, they had come from Egypt. And Egypt is a land full of many gods. I mean, the idea that God would say to Moses, you only need to worship me, nobody else, would have blown the mind of the Hebrew people who had been surrounded by many gods, maybe even building structures to them under the slavery in Egypt. I mean, the God of sun, the God of death. But there's not just a God of death, there's a God of preparation of death. The God of protection, the God of the Nile. There's a God for all animals, a God for stars, a God for prosperity. And you pray to each individual God based on what you're looking for and what you need. And there are hundreds and hundreds of gods throughout Egypt. So God starts the conversation, the God of Israel starts the conversation this way. It's just me and you. That's it. See, something happened throughout our society where the world moved from worshiping the Creator to worshiping His creation. And we've never looked back. See, there's a God who made everything, but we seem to be more interested in worshiping the things He made versus worshiping Him Himself. So they would rather worship the sun than the Creator of the sun. They would rather worship the Nile River than the God who created the Nile River. It's real easy, folks. Not just in Egypt. It's real easy in Sydney, Ohio, to worship creation versus creator. And that's exactly what they were doing. It's funny because all God was saying over and over again is, no matter what you think, it's just me. That's what He said to Moses. It's what He's saying to us. Just me. Just me. Let's look at commandment number 2. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. Now, why would God need to have this commandment at all if we've already determined that we can only worship Him? Now, if it's just Him, then obviously idols are already to the side. No. God is saying, do not make an idol of me. God is saying, now that we've determined that it's just me and you, now do not make any image and call it me. No idols. Well, this is ludicrous. Every god has an idol. You make some sort of structure, some sort of animal or some sort of tree or something, and you leave it somewhere special. And then when you want to interact with the god, you go to the idol, which puts you in the presence of the god, and you pray to it. And then you can walk away. And what God is saying to the people is, do not fashion anything and call it me. Now, that means do not fashion anything in heaven above. I don't want to see images of angels. I don't want to see images of stars or the sky, and somehow you're going to make some sort of idol of those things and call it God, me. No, you're not going to do that. I don't want you to make images or anything on earth below or anything that you see like a tree or a river or a person. I don't want you to take any of those things and turn it into somehow you got to pray to that rather than speak to me. And I got to tell you, and I'm going to stomp on a couple feet, and I'm okay with it. This still exists. I believe that when we pray to people who have died, even if they have the word saint in front of their name, instead of to God directly, I believe that dishonors God. We have access to Him. We don't need to pray to people. Things beneath the sky. Or even things in the water. He's basically covering all of his bases. And he's saying, do not make anything an image that somehow makes you think you're closer to me in that moment. When you hold a cross in your hand, people, you are not closer to God than when your hand is empty. There are no images that somehow put us more in the presence of God than right now. Right now, you are in the presence of God. In the shower, you're in the presence of God. While you're asleep, you're in the presence of God. God, this specific commandment is not about who we worship. It's about how we worship. Commandment 1 says it's just you and me. Commandment 2 says there's a way to do this and there's a way we're not going to do this. You're not going to fashion idols and somehow call that me. Because the truth is that there is nothing that can represent God. Do you hear me? There is nothing that can represent God. We were not made to worship a thing. We were made to worship the God of the universe who we can't see. In fact, Jesus taught us this as well. I mean, we're fast forwarding thousands of years. Jesus is talking to a Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. And Jesus is talking to her, and she says, well, I know we have disagreements, and we think, God still exists over here on this mountain, and you guys think he's down in Jerusalem. And Jesus says, no, it's not about that. Jesus says this to her in John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. He says, yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers, remember how we worship is the second commandment. The true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the spirit and in truth. The worship that we have with God above is not about your pastor. It's not about the music. It's not about the giant cross. It's about something that we absolutely cannot see. We're all here. I mean, believe it or not, we're all here for something we cannot see. Isn't that weird? It's really bizarre if you stop and think about it. We all gathered here together in the same place pretty much every Sunday to look at each other, but we're actually here for something that we can't see. But what I want to tell you is God was never meant to be seen in the form of an idol or a statue or in the form of an image like a cross. What I want to say is that we were meant to worship a God we struggle to grasp. We were meant to worship a God that we struggle to grasp. That's the whole point. He's so big and so great that we can't box him in. He's so big that we can't even wrap our heads around it. The conversation about idols doesn't stop with waters beneath. It actually keeps going. He continues to say this in the beginning of verse 5. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Well, I thought jealousy is wrong. God does something wrong. He's jealous. When it comes to you and I, God is so jealous. So jealous. He will not share us with anyone or anything. And any time that we try to make him into something smaller that we can manage, we lose pieces of who he is, and he's not okay with it. He's a big, jealous God that we have no control over. Imagine this. Imagine a wife comes home to her house at the end of a day and finds her husband with another woman. And she looks at her husband and she says, "What are you doing?" And he responds to her, "Sweetheart, her hair, her beauty, her smile, they just reminded me of you. So we're good, right?" Every wife in the room is like, "I'd kill you," to her husband. I mean, that's kind of what we do, isn't it? If you think about it, we take pieces of who God is, the pieces we like. We like the God of love. We just don't really care for the God of wrath, even though he's both. So we take all the pieces we like, and we make something new, and then we try to convince God that it's okay. God is a jealous God. He's not dealing with that nonsense. So to fast forward the story, eventually Moses comes down with the tablets that God had written, and he finds the Israelite people who took a bunch of gold, and while he was dealing with them and dealing with God, they had fashioned a calf, a golden calf. But it's okay, right? Because we're worshiping the God of Israel. We're not worshiping a different God. It's the God of Israel, just in the form of this beautiful golden calf. Moses flips out, throws the tablets, they break. Eventually, he's got to go up and ask God to write them again. Right? So he and God are now in verse 34 having the same similar conversation up on Mount Sinai. And then this part of it really stuck out to me in chapter 34, verse 14. God says this to Moses: "Do not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." So just so we're clear, God's not bending on jealousy. He's actually named himself jealous. It's part of who he is. You better get used to it. God will not fight with you over first place. He is first place. Or he is not your God. That's where he's at. What he's trying to communicate to them, and I think what he's trying to communicate to us, is that God is communicating that he wants all of you. A real relationship. Right? Any relationship that you've been in your life where you don't really have all of the other person, where they're not all in, it doesn't really work. It never works. God is saying, I want a real relationship. I want all of you. So that leads to the question, how do I know if I'm worshiping God or I'm worshiping an idol of God? How do I know if he has all of me? Well, what I would say to you is if you can set God aside, you're worshiping an idol of him, not him. So let me be the first to say it. Many times in my life, I have worshiped an idol of God and not God himself. Many times in my life, I have called myself a Christian. But the truth is, he didn't have all of me, he had some of me. Because I liked the fact that I was in control and that I could literally just set him aside. You ever done that? You just set him aside and go, okay, God, we're good. I love you, but I'm going to handle this one on my own. If God is small enough that you can set him aside, whatever you're worshiping is not a complete picture of who God is. He's bigger than that. He cannot be set aside. He cannot be boxed in. Boxed in. When I thought of the picture of boxing God in, immediately my mind went to a calendar. You know, every calendar we have is like full of boxes, right? But if I can box God into my life, I can probably also box God in on the calendar. See, I think one of the idols that we worship the most is the one that I'll call the God of Sundays. It's a version of God that only exists in our life one day a week. We've boxed him in to a specific day so that we can spend the rest of our time living the way we want to live. God, I love you. I don't want to worship any other God. But here's the deal. I kind of like my life the way it is. I'm going to do what I want to do, but I'll give you Sundays. If that hits home to you, I want you to know it hits home to me. The story of my life is the story of a guy who loved to give God Sundays. 12-year-old Tim, 17-year-old Tim, 25-year-old Tim. Me and God were super tight on Sundays. He gets one box of the 7. And I spent many, many years of my life miserable. Because I couldn't figure out why the God of Sundays wasn't changing my life. All he got was Sundays. And it wasn't God. If you can box him in, you're not worshiping God. Why do you think I'm so passionate about the phrase everyday disciples, by the way? Why do you think that hits me so hard? Because I've been a one-day disciple and it's terrible. God is calling us to more, and I will not rest until I am more. I can't do it for you, but I sure can do it for me. God is calling us to more. So my question to you is this: what pieces of your life get placed in front of God? What breaks commandment number 1? What pieces of your life get in front of your ability to put God first? I started to think about what I would think 15 years ago if I had heard this same message. And I think I wrote down what I think I would have said. I would have said, just because I have something in my life that takes up more of my time, my resources, and my thoughts than God, doesn't mean it's more important. Just because there's something in my life that takes everything I got, has all of my attention, has all of my resources, doesn't mean I don't love God well. It actually does. If there is something in your life that takes up more of your time, more of your thoughts, more of your money, more of your life or your responsibility, more of your priorities, if there's something that if it was put up against connecting with God, you would choose that over connecting with God, I want you to know that it has become your God. And that doesn't mean that you do it all the time. And it doesn't mean that you're the only one in the room, because trust me, the struggle of following Jesus for the rest of our life is going to be keeping him first. But don't make excuses. If there are things in your life that you elevate as your number one priority, just understand that God is not your number one priority. It's just the truth. It means that God has become so small you can leave his presence and check in with him later, which is actually the definition of having an idol. Well, I don't think God puts us through all this just because he's jealous. I think he sees something that we can't see. I think that God just wants to keep free people free. He had rescued them from slavery, and he had brought them into this new place. And they're on this journey together. They have no laws. They have no rules. They have no idea how to exist without people telling them what to do. He had made them free people. But here's the truth. If they don't follow what God is calling of them, they may be free physically, but they are not free spiritually. God was not willing to move his people from slavery of Egypt to slavery of sin. What I would say to you today is that God is interested in your freedom as well. How do I know that God wanted them to be free? Well, it's actually the rest of the second commandment. So he says, I am a jealous God. And then he says this, ready? This isn't going to sit well. He says, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now you can read that and go, dang, that's harsh. But let's be real. If you're following a version of God that isn't really God, that affects how your children see God, which affects how their children see God. The reason he says of those who hate me is because he's a jealous God. So if we're not together, you must hate me. all right? But what he knows is that if you're following a version of him that's not all of him, if you're not acknowledging his greatness, if you're not all in every day instead of just Sundays, you're setting an example for the next generation. Even if you don't have kids, the kids in the room see you, and it's going to punish them and future generations. But the hope, if you'll accept all of God, if you'll step into a relationship with him that exists every day, if you'll try to let him stay in the front of your life, in the center of your life, and the back of your life at the exact same time, if you'll give all you have to him, not 3 or 4 generations, 1,000 generations will experience the love, because that will be built off of by each generation after. It's not God is saying punishment to you, love to you. That's not what he's saying. He's saying this is the natural consequence of either following God wholly or giving him some of you.